डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी.
Welcome to Chaitanya Studio of Babasaheb Ambedkar University. My name is Professor Sachin Ketkar, and we are going to talk about translation theory in MA English program, and we are going to discuss a seminal theory of translation by Roman Jackobson, which is part of the 7th unit in translation theory. So, I welcome all of you, and we begin this discussion right away. Some of us might be aware of the name of Roman Jackobson, and he is one of the most influential linguist and literary theorist of 20th century. And he started out as one of the founding members of the Moscow Linguistic Circle, and he was also associated with another very seminal and influential group called the Prague Linguistic Circle. And these two groups, Moscow Linguistic Circle and Prague Linguistic Circle, together constitute what is known as Russian formalism, a very influential movement in literary studies. And many of us might also be aware of the communication model that Roman Jackobson has given, which is very often found in communication skills theory books and wherever communication is studied. So, Roman Jackobson is a very well known name. We will be focusing on his very important essay titled On Linguistics Aspects of Translation, which appeared way back in 1959, and it is a groundbreaking work, and his semiotic approach to the question of translation actually opens up whole new way of looking and conceptualizing and theorizing translation. And one of the great advantages of such an approach is that it goes beyond our conventional understanding of translation, which in my view is flawed. So, this in some way is a beginning of a new approach, new perspective on translation, which we as students of translation and literature should keep in mind. So, let us look at this essay, Linguistic Aspects of Translation. But before we go into that, we will have to understand the conceptual and theoretical backgrounds on which the whole essay is based. And the work of Roman Jackobson is actually based on these two very important intellectual traditions, if you may say so. So, let us look at the basis, the basics and the foundation of Roman Jackobson's theory of translation. So, let us look at the first very influential important base. The first basis of Roman Jackobson's theory is something called semiotics, and semiotics is slightly different from linguistics. Linguistics is a scientific study of language, as we are aware, but semiotics is a study of meaning production, which is a broader category, which involves all the forms of production of meaning, like in fashion, like traffic signal, like Morse code and the secret codes, and all forms of cultural communication is something that is studied under semiotics. So, one of the first articulations of semiotics was by Ferdinand de Saussure, who is also called father of modern linguistics in the West. Such is the place of Ferdinand de Saussure, and he defined semiotics. In his word, he called it semiology as the life of science within society. And very famously, Saussure created a new way of looking at language and studying language by making a distinction between language and speech, langue and parole as it is called, because most of the study of language before Saussure was under a discipline called philology, and under philology people studied language as made up of primarily of texts, and they studied those texts in historical way. So, a philological approach to the study of Hindi would take into account the texts that were written in 13th century, 14th century, 19th century. So, that is how language would be studied. Saussure moves away from this approach and he introduces a new object of studying language. For him, language is not made up primarily of texts, but the system of signs and system which is internalized by people, which is called lang, which means language. So, language is not texts, but a system that produces text. It is made up of rules, conventions, grammar and norms of all kinds, which we have internalized as part of growing up. So, lang is internalized, which makes the production of paroles possible. So, I am speaking just now with all of you, and you are able to comprehend what I am saying because you have internalized the same lang as I have, which makes the communication between both of us possible. So, he introduces a new subject of studying language. He also made a very important intervention by looking at language as a system of signs, as a part of semiotics. And sign is, in Saussure's terminology, a dyadic or having two parts, two-dimensional entity. And these two dimensionals are called the signifier, or something which signals the meaning, and a mental meaning, that is the signified. So, the color red would be a signifier, and we comprehend it as stop in traffic signals. So, that red is signifier and stop, the meaning that we get is signified. So, language is a part of the signaling mechanisms of culture. So, culture is a large assemblage of signs and signifying systems. So, this is a very important idea, and in many ways it is a revolutionary idea, and we have to acknowledge what is so revolutionary about this is that very often we associate meaning with the object or referent. For example, the word cat means that animal that you can see. So, we associate the meaning of the word cat, cat with the animal which we can see. So, we are left with an impression that in order to understand the meaning of a word, we have to know the object. Now, the problem arises because we also can understand words whose objects we have not seen, like Amrit, right, ambrosia. Now, nobody has seen Amrit, at least I do not know anybody who has consumed or seen Amrit. So, but we understand what it means, right. So, the meaning of a word is not the physical entity or the referent, but a concept in our mind. So, the meaning is mental construction. Now, this is a revolutionary idea, especially it has got great deal of implications for the study of translation and language. And a very important other notion that Saussure introduces is that the relationship between word and the meaning, signifier and the signified, is not a natural thing. In fact, it is conventional and a kind of norm, right, something which he calls the code, and the idea of code is very important for study of language. All languages are made up of codes of all kinds, and language is a system of codes which associate signifier with the signified. Another very revolutionary idea that he seems to put forth is that each element of in a linguistic system is identifiable, recognizable, largely because of the difference from other elements of the language, which means that it is defined by differences, right. So, for example, the sound p is recognizable because it is different from all other elements of sign in the language. So, it does not have an autonomous existence, and this is also a very influential idea, the system of so that language is arbitrarily constructed and it is made up of differences is a revolutionary idea which is so influential that even the later philosophers of language and thinkers of language like Jacques Derrida and others would not have any main important quarrel with these ideas. So, some of the key assumptions of structuralism are continued even in post structuralism, an idea that you might be familiar with. So, this is one framework that we have to bear in mind while we think about Jackobson's theory of translation. So, now let us take a look at another important framework, and this framework was developed parallelly to Saussure's framework, but Saussure did not know about this theorization which came from America. Saussure was a Swiss linguist. The another important theorization came from America in form of Charles Sanders Peirce, though it is written as P-I-E-R-C-E, pronounced as Peirce. So, Charles Sanders Peirce was a very important American philosopher who is also associated with a movement called pragmatism in American intellectual history. And Charles Sanders Peirce developed his own theory of semiotics and science, and it was largely associated with his own efforts to theorize logic. So, unlike Saussure, Peirce is developing theory of semiotics in the service of logic, and he comes up with a very different notion of sign. In fact, he goes on to define sign in a triadic fashion. That means it has 3 dimensions, unlike Saussure's theory which has got 2 dimensions. Peirce's theory has got 3 dimensions. Sign has 3 dimensions. So, how does he define sign? He defines sign as a sign is something which stands to somebody for something in some respect. Sign is that which stands for somebody, for something in some respect or capacity. And he says that this has got these 3 components. The first component is called the representamen, and it has got an object of representation, and thirdly it has got interpretant. Now, these terms need some explanation. For example, white garment, right? In Saussurean terminology, the white garment would mean signifier, and it would have a meaning. Say for example, if it is ancient Hindu system, then the white garment stands for widowhood, purity, and high moral life that is expected from a widow. While in a Christian setup, the white garment stands for the occasion of wedding and celebration. So, same signifier may have 2 different signifieds, sometimes almost opposite of each other. So, that is Saussurean terminology. In Saussurean terminology, the meaning does not have any objective component. That means signified is completely mental. Peirce makes a triadic formulation. For him, the white color garment is the representamen, while purity of a widowhood is the object of representation. But it is not for all, right? It is only for those who follow this code, this meaning, right? So, the impact of white color would be on somebody, right? And this impact is called interpretant, right? And it would change from, say for example, Hindu Brahmin family, Orthodox, to Christian family. So, interpretant is the impact of the sign on the person. Interpretant does not mean an interpreter. We don't have to confuse interpretant with interpreter, but it's more about a pragmatic impact on somebody. Now, Peirce elaborates upon this by saying that meaning of a sign is the sign it has to be translated into, and that the meaning of a representation can nothing be but another interpretation. And sign is not a sign unless it translates itself into another sign in which it has more fully developed. So, what does it mean? It means that the impact on the person, right, which the sign leaves, the interpretant, itself becomes representamen. It itself becomes a sign for something else, which is more developed than the other. And this process of representation is called semiosis by Peirce. And this semiosis is not once or for all phenomena, but it is unlimited semiosis, as Umberto Eco, a very famous semiotician, has described Peircean system. So, what is happening here is that white colored garment becomes the sign of purity for an orthodox Hindu family, right, but this meaning itself becomes a meaning for something else, and it goes on and on and on, right. So, semiosis does not come to halt with representamen, it continues. For example, bachelor, and this is the example given by Jackobson himself, is explained as an unmarried man. But then what do you mean by unmarried, right? So, you have to understand what is marriage. So, meaning of marriage will require more interpretation, further interpretation, and that will require further representation, and so on and so forth. It's an ongoing thing, unlimited semiosis. And this is very similar to Jacques Derrida's idea of difference, where meaning of one sign is another sign, and that sign is again leading to some other sign, and there is no stoppage. It's almost infinite, ad infinitum it goes on. So, for example, you don't know the meaning of Tyrannosaurus rex. So, you look up a glossary or a dictionary, and it explains that it is a kind of dinosaur in some period of Jurassic period of prehistory. Now, you don't know what is Jurassic period. So, you will again look up what is Jurassic period. So, Jurassic period, which is the interpretant of the sign Tyrannosaurus, becomes again a sign for something else, and it goes on. What is important for us as students of translation here is that this meaning itself is understood as translational act. That is what Peirce says, if you look at the slide here, that the meaning of a sign is the sign into which it is translated. So, signifier and signified relationship itself is a kind of translation, which means that comprehension itself is a form of translation. I am saying something with here, and you are interpreting what I am saying in your mind. Now, this act, according to Peirce, would be an act of translation. So, this is the Peircean model that Jackobson is using for his theory of translation. So, let us look at now that we are prepared to look at Jacobson's theory of translation with these two basic formulations in our mind for semiotics. So, what does it mean for translation? If understanding itself is an act of translation, sign which refers to another sign which refers to another sign, and so on, then translation also is a form of interpretative activity. And there are three ways in which people interpret signs. And these three ways obviously become the three ways of translating, because interpretation and sign are synonymous for Jackobson, and that is the strength of his position, but it is also one of the limitations of his positions, as we will see later on. So, there are three ways of translating, which means you can understand something in three ways. One is intralingual translation, which is rewording basically, which means that I am saying something and you understand it in the same language. It's called rewording. Teachers explaining an idea like what I am doing right now is translating for you, right? So, teaching itself is a translational act. So, if you are explaining something to your sibling, younger brother or sister, or you are explaining something in the same language, for Jackobson that explanatory activity is also a kind of translation into the same language, intralingual translation. The other kind of translation here is interlingual, which means between the two languages. So, if you explain something in some other language, right, or is called translational activity, which is interlingual. The first was intralingual, within a same language, interlingual, between two language. And this is what we understand as translation proper in Jackobson's phrase. So, he uses this phrase translation proper, because this is the meaning of, this is the narrow definition of translation, right, between two languages. But for Jackobson, it is a broader definition that he is proposing. So, there is a third kind of translational activity that all of us do, and that is called the intersemiotic translation, which means you are interpreting verbal signs by non-verbal signs, and those non-verbal signs might be an image or a music or an audio-visual text or gestures, body language, right. And I am sure you must have played a game called dumb charades, where somebody gives you name of a film or a film song on a chit and you perform it, right, without speaking. So, this is translation of intersemiotic kind. Another example would be, for example, you might have seen the sign on electrical transponder, danger, right. So, danger would be represented by a skull and bones. That would be an intersemiotic translation of the idea of danger. There would also be word like khatra used. So, danger and khatra. So, khatra would be an example of interlingual translation. So, these are the things that we do all the times, which means all of us are translators in this broad sense of the word translation. Now, why is this big deal? This triadic or tripartite division of translation as interpretation, semiotic interpretation that Jackobson has given, why is it such a big deal? It is a big deal because we have been used to talk about translation and the problems of translation in a very incorrect manner. For example, a line by a great Gujarati poet like Kalapi or Meghani, how will you translate it into English? That is the question that very often people throw at us. Jackobson would say that even within that language, you cannot come up with exact equivalents. He says the intralingual translation of a word uses another or more or less synonymous word or resorts to circumlocution. Yet synonymy is as a rule not complete equivalence. which means there is no equivalence even in Gujarati, right? So, how will you explain Lagyo Kasumbino Rang in some other words, right? And if you do it even in Gujarati, it's not going to be the exact equivalent. So, there is no equivalence, exact equivalence at the level of the same language. So, if we ask what are the equivalents for these poetic lines in English, we are asking a wrong question, right, because the exact equivalence is not there even within the same language. And this notion of, or this understanding of lack of equivalence, synonymy does not mean equivalence, right? That is what something that we have to keep in mind. Synonymy is something itself approximate equivalent. So, a dictionary, Gujarati to Gujarati dictionary will not give you exact equivalence. It will give you circumlocutions, it will give you explanations and so on. So, this theory by Jackobson helps us to come out of this flawed understanding of synonymy as exact equivalence, because it does not exist even within the same language, and if it does not exist even within the same language, you cannot really expect it to exist between two different languages. So, this myth of synonymy as exact equivalence is one of the reasons why we get trapped in a very limited way of thinking about translation, and that is something which is detrimental to our understanding of translation here. So, translation is part and parcel of unlimited semiosis, representamen, object of representation, interpretant, which becomes another representamen, and it goes on and on. And this is something very important for us to understand. One of another arguments which Jackobson is critiquing here is this widely held notion of linguistic relativism. Yes. So, what we have studied till now is what are the conceptual basis of Jackobson's theory of translation, and we have seen how his triadic theory of translation goes beyond the conventional and flawed understanding of translation that we hold on to, cling on to for some reason, that synonymy means exact equivalence even within the same language. So, this broader understanding of translation is a seminal intervention by Jackobson, and we will now look at his further arguments and critique of his theory in the later class. So, this is where we want to stop for this class just now. So, I want to thank you for this, and we will take up the next topic related to Jackobson's theory of translation in the next class.